on council.
Okay.
We've done general obligation bond.
And
so there's a lot of things you got to do for that. Yeah, and 2/3. But yeah, I think it's the first extra revenue bond we've done since you've been on.
Okay. Thank you.
So Raft House has a history with the town. As you may recall, they performed our utility rate study some years ago. So the model that you will see today focuses on the water and the wastewater utility fund, and in the future, we'll have one on the electric fund. So as we were planning for this revenue bond, our big focus was on affordability. Last spring, finance, budget, and water resources met to discuss the projects that could be funded by this revenue bond. And some of those projects include the Big Branch Pump Station, the Raleigh Water Line, and an elevated water tank. There's some other projects, but those are the main ones. In addition, this model also includes funding for projects that we have in partnership with CARE. So as we were working with Raft House on this model, our strategy was to think globally and look at the CIP for the upcoming project over the next 5 to 10 years, instead of just focusing on our current needs. The CIP is currently being updated as part of the annual budget cycle. And about 4 or 5 years ago, we contracted to have our rate model completed, and annually that model is updated by our budget department. So all the information from the rate model to the CIP has really shaped the affordability study that you're going to see today. So we are looking to have a full rate model completed during FY26, and all of these things working in conjunction will play into that rate model. So with that, I will introduce our guests. We have Will Kerr here from Raft House, who will be presenting today. And virtually, we have our financial advisors, DEC, who have played a significant role in all these planning decisions. I do want to stress that this model is based off information as we know today. As prices change, as information changes, we'll be updating the model. So with that, I'll turn it over to Will.
Sure. Yeah, well, thanks for the setup, Jessica. My name is Will Kerr. I work for Raft House, as mentioned. Had the pleasure of working with staff for the last several months to complete the financial planning and debt affordability study, and happy to be here to present the results. Appreciate y'all's time today. So here's the agenda for the discussion today. We'll talk a little bit about the background of the study, though Jessica did a nice job, so I don't know that I need to elaborate a whole lot more there. Then we'll move into the things that we're thinking about when we're doing the financial planning components here, the drivers of our financial forecast. And then we'll move into our scenario evaluation and results, and love to hear y'all's thoughts and input on those outcomes. But recognize we're at the end of the day here, so I'll move through. But just if you guys have any questions as we go, feel free to chime in, and happy to discuss anything you see there. So like Jessica said, we've been working over the last couple of months to do this debt affordability study. What we've done is we took the rate model developed several years ago that's been annually updated. We augmented that to be able to accommodate and run the scenarios we needed it to run. The goal here is to establish a plan. And the overarching question is what can we afford? And there's kind of 3 things that we're trying to evaluate as part of this study. And the first piece is, what can we afford to do in our CIP? We've got a lot of capital needs in our water and sewer system. So what is it that we can afford to take on? Second question is, how much can we afford in the near term to borrow? If we're going to do a revenue bond issuance in the near term, we've got to understand how much we can take on from the get-go. And then the third piece is really understanding kind of the balancing act of delivering this CIP while managing customer impacts. We want to make sure that we're thoughtful about the way that these costs impact our customers. So that's a huge piece of it as well. And we'll talk about how these things interplay with each other as we go. So a real quick overview here of just financial planning in general. And like Jessica said, the goal here is to make a plan. So we're forecasting, we're projecting out 10 years into the future. And we all know it's really hard to project 10 years into the future. It's hard to project what's going to happen next year. But what we've done is we've developed this model that forecasts the revenues and expenses for the water and sewer systems. And then what we want to do with the model is evaluate the sufficiency of our revenues to cover those costs and achieve key targets. So on the expense side, that's our operating expenses. It's also our capital cost. So it's going to be our debt service on existing debt, any future debt we take on, and then it's also going to be the cost of delivering that CIP. Our revenues are driven really by the number of customers that we have, the amount of water and sewer that they use. So we spend some time gathering customer billing data. We project accounts and usage forward into the future, and we apply rates and charges to that to come up with a dynamic forecast of revenues out into the future. And then the balancing mechanism and all that is our financial policies. It's making sure that we've got adequate reserves and that we've got adequate debt service coverage, that we can afford to take on the debt that we're seeking. So I'm going to hit a couple of the key assumptions, and they're a little out of order, but you guys just, chime in, ask any questions as we go here. But leading off with CIP, and I'm really, I guess they're not out of order, but they're synced in matter of importance to our analysis. The CIP is a big one. So we've got about $150 million in projects, between the CIP and projects that are previously approved and unfunded, that need to be addressed over the next 10 years. About half of that is associated with 3 big projects. It's the Big Branch Pump Station in Force Main, $40 million project in the near term. It's a $30 million expansion for the Cary wastewater treatment plant, and a $16 million expansion with the Cary water treatment facility. And so you can see some of the spikes on our CIP there, that correspond to those projects. But that's a lot of money. It's $15 million a year for these funds to deliver the CIP. When we're looking at debt affordability modeling, of course, another big piece is debt service. We've got some existing debt out there. As was mentioned earlier, there are no revenue bonds outstanding on the water and sewer fund right now. There's some GEO debt, some revolving loans, and then we've got a share of Cary wastewater treatment debt we're responsible for. Then we've got some future debt in our analysis. And where we landed and what we'll show you in these scenarios is it's looking like something in the $30-35 million range for fiscal 2026 is a pretty good spot. And then we've also, there will likely be need for additional borrowings out into the future as those Cary, as our share of those Cary projects comes to fruition. But you can see it kind of layers on. This is our debt profile over here. So this is, our annual debt service. You can see our existing debt there. It actually drops a little bit there in fiscal 2029. But you can see the new debt payments layering in on top of that, starting in fiscal 26.
What's the GEO bond that we have for water and sewer?
It predates any of us in the room.
Yeah.
Marty, do you know, or Mike, you won't know the fund, you don't know the formula, but
Usually, right?
yeah, we can look it up. It happens because it's potentially a lower interest rate. So just depending on if that was the best interest rate that could be gotten at that time. If there's not a lot of difference between revenue and GEO, it's easy to move through a revenue, but then on what the size of that interest rate. So, I have to look at exactly which project that was.
It's fairly common for these types of projects to be wrapped into like a bigger GEO issuance. That's not happening, especially.
If you're going to the market already for something else,
Exactly.
you cut your administrative fees.
You do that, you do that transportation.
And I mean, it'll be broken up on your referendum. So what it is, because it's different type, but it does make it, the process of going through the LGC and through the market sometimes can be a little bit, you're already doing it. It helps out that way.
All right, so our other key assumptions, so those are kind of 2 10-year looks at the CIP and debt service that will be responsible. Other key assumptions, so on rounding out the cost side is our operating expenses. We started with fiscal 26 budget as kind of the baseline for our forecast. We went category by category to develop cost escalation rates, but the resulting blended rate of change year over year is about 4%. So that O&M creeping up at about 4% per year. Jumping over to the revenue side of things, again, the big driver is really going to be customer growth. And we're going to talk about that a lot as we review some of the scenarios we've prepared for you today. But customer growth in the water sewer fund on the revenue side does 2 things. One, it increases our monthly user charge revenue through increases in base charges and volumetric charges. But it also generates system development fee revenues. As we add new customers to the system as they get connected, and as that development occurs, we're going to collect system development fee revenue as well. And that's kind of a key variable as we look at our scenarios that we'll spend some time focusing. And then one last piece here is it's all tied together. So as we project increases in customers, it's synced up to calculate system development fee revenues. And then it also is projecting water and sewer flows following those growth. And pretty much everything outside of the the monthly user charges and system development fees, which is probably well over 90% of our water and sewer revenues. The rest of that, is left flat based on fiscal 20. Any questions on those assumptions?
I guess, I looked ahead a little bit, but if I could time to ask about the SDF revenue, like there's a big discussion about tax rate we get into, or, the utility rates that we're getting into. What flexibility do we have in setting the SDF rates for water? Remember, we had a little discussion last year before, whenever I think we did a study with it. Some words were exchanged and we were unclear if we were charging enough to cover it. And I think the high level overview I'm getting kind of maybe a little naively, but it seems like our SDF fees are too low. If we're struggling we need to raise our utility rates, by a certain percent in order to cover this. Isn't that what SDF fees are for? It's for this stuff.
I mean, from your
Yeah.
perspective, I don't want to speak too much out of Marty's turn, and then also you're doing the analysis. What I can speak to is there are limits on, so there's basically a prescription for how they have to be derived. And so I just received that information usually. So I know there's a prescription from the utility side and maybe from the Raft, they can maybe give a better talk about how that prescription guides into what you get out of that. So there are some limitations on it's a call to see, I don't know what the impact is, but the way the law is written, it does kind of cap what will be there, what you can bring in. So
Yeah, the calculation has certain requirements built into it, the statutory instruction of the calculation of the fee.
Is there any flexibility in that calculation?
Yeah, well, you can do combined methods, or buy-in methods, so there's a couple.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. That was
But one of the things you got to look at, so combined method is you can look at future projects that you're going to build, which adds to your capacity. Buy-in is, this is how much capacity I have. And so it's kind of like if you have you know, you've got a certain capacity, if you got 100 of them, and every time somebody takes one away, you don't have it anymore, right? So essentially what you're doing is you're selling capacity to your customer. So they're guaranteed when they turn on that faucet, they get water.
Is that what we're doing?
That's what you're doing.
Okay, but wasn't there another one that was tied to future infrastructure?
That's the
growth?
combined. That's the buy-in. So combined, you look and say, okay, we're going to have to build some additional capacity. So then you look and you can only take 25% unless the numbers have changed. Lori, I don't know.
I haven't looked at the statute.
I haven't looked at it either, so I'm going on memory here. I think I'm close. 25% of the value. So if you think it's going to cost $100,000, you can only use $75,000 of that cost when you add it to your asset, to your value of your asset, right? But you have to use the entire volume of water capacity that you're adding. So when you're then considering, you work on calculating your cost per gallon of water that you have available. So if your cost goes up, you know, you have to reduce the estimated buy-in cost by 25% because it's not actual cost, right? You're estimating it. And then you take the volume that you're adding, the denominator can actually bring your price down depending on how, because you can't include all of the cost. So sometimes you're better off to wait until you actually construct it and then do buy-in, because then you know your actual cost. If that makes sense. Because then you get to include your full cost in your value of your system, and you're adding that full amount. Like you had 1 million gallons of capacity and we had 2, now you're dividing by 3. Think about how that works in division, and you can see what it would do to your cost per gallon.
The other trick is the funds are restricted. So they're restricted for growth related projects. We have assumed that this plan uses some of the funding that we built up in the system development fee fund to address some future projects. So there's a lot going on there. It's very dynamic and fluid, but we're definitely assuming that some of these projects are funded in the system.
Okay, yeah, I guess what I'm hearing is I can't set the SDF fee, and we think the fees are fine.
You can't set it. So
You wouldn't?
so you can't set it, we'll stop.
You can't set.
Leave it at that.
It just seems strange because the purpose of the SDF is to fund this stuff. I know we did a study that, you know, Kevin, I remember the buy-in thing, I remember we had a bunch of numbers that were all estimates. I just felt like as we're going through this, we'd have more precise estimates that maybe would allow us to revisit some of the SDF fees. Because it just seems like it's busted. Like the purpose of the SDF is to fund this.
Which we do occasionally revisit.
You have to do it every 5 years, but we can do it as often as you want. Is that correct, Laura?
I believe that's correct. I would think it's a minimum of 3.
5.
With the, what was that? Yellow questions here, Ed?
Yeah, I think so. I'll just do on that.
Okay. With the growth forecasts, it seems like things like I guess what factors affect the growth? It seems like land use choices is going to be a major thing that affects the growth. Commercial, residential, and like the density of residential, I assume the more dense, the usually less usage per unit of water and sewer. Is that correct? Is the model kind of looking at our land use planning and possible uses as far as commercial goes to see what would happen?
It doesn't factor in land use planning. It doesn't open that can of worms. I'll put it that way. It's a little more simple from top level. You know, we're projecting residential growth at X amount, commercial growth at X.
Am I correct that those factors are real, and like we have more townhomes or single family homes in the future, the growth would be more closer to that lower percentage than the higher one potentially?
It would, yeah. I mean, your growth in volumes, you're probably right. In a multifamily setup, the use per unit would be a little lower. We do usually see a little higher volumes for single family dwellings. But you get larger users on one, parcel. So there's some give and take.
In the commercial, I know there's some industries, I assume, that are just like gigantic water users. And if we're worried about this, the growth part, we would probably maybe not want necessarily those industries as much as a place that has plenty of capacity, I assume. Or not, I'm not sure. I'm just trying to figure out how this connects to the rest of the town, with what the town does in that way. Anyway,
I feel like I'll leave that one up to the town. I mean, that's totally, it feels like more of a strategic directional type thing for council.
I mean, a place that has not very many jobs, but a ton of water usage, maybe not be the best fit in the future.
I think there are a lot of factors on it, because there are other revenues that would be associated.
Yeah.
With that. So it wouldn't necessarily be that.
This can be one aspect of things to consider, though.
Right.
In these different growth models and the cost of them. Okay.
Yeah, and you'd want to understand, you're talking about, you think about large water users, if it's just like a microbrewery or something, that's one thing, but if it's like a huge manufacturing facility, that's something else. So I do think there's definitely, it's very reasonable to think about as growth occurs, whether you got the capacity and the distribution collection system, stuff like that to serve, the large volume users is super important.
Okay, and this model is not really thinking about that level of detail. It's more about just growth percentages here.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything else? All right. So here was sort of the process that we went through. So we laid out our financial forecast, and then we wanted to test and understand how some of these variables interplayed with each other. So there were three big ones that we were focused on. It's the growth and the resulting system development fee revenues, and that's a big driver of the forecast. It's capital project timing. So to the extent that we don't have revenues to support our capital plan, projects would have to get pushed out. And so to the extent that the capital plan that we show decreases in the capital plan, that basically means pushing projects off and out. And then finally, rates and rate increases. Again, that's one of the few mechanisms for increasing our rates and revenues. And we'll talk about how these things all work together in just a second. As mentioned, we've got some financial planning targets. We worked with Doug Carter to come up with these. We're targeting debt service coverage minimum of 1.5 total debt, and then days cash on hand, 365 days. And that is fairly consistent with a AA rating, which would be, consistent with where Apex may land, as you go down the revenue. All right, so do folks have scenarios scheduled? Okay, all right, perfect. So we are passing around some scenarios here, and I know there's lots of information on these tables. I'm going to come back to the summary of results tab here. But I wanted to just spend some time walking through basically how to read one of these sheets that's in front of you. So we've got 4 scenarios in here. And right now we're looking at scenario 1A. And I'll just kind of walk you through what you're looking at here. Scenario 1A, this is our high growth scenario. So if growth continues about 4% clip year over year for the next 10 years, this is kind of how the forecast shakes out. So it would result in about between 6 and 7 million in system development fee revenues. So that's a lot of revenue available for capital projects. Now moving down the list here, we've got our CIP, we've got our annual funding needs over here. We've got that's our 150 million there. And you can see the breakdown of funding sources, if you like the numbers. But basically the big takeaway here is that the CIP is fully funded under this scenario with just rate increases of 2.2% per year. So that's that line right there, kind of in the middle, highlighted in blue. And these charts down here, I think, help tell the story a little easier. So you can see what we've done is we've worked around, excuse me, the targets that we just talked about. And we've basically dialed in the forecast so that we are meeting these targets dead on, kind of depending on the scenario and the limiting factors. For this particular one, it's cash balances out in the future. That 2.2% increase, it keeps us just north or right around 365 days through the 10-year forecast. And it is a pretty good look there. And I will mention again, this is our high growth scenario and probably a little optimistic to assume that growth just keeps, going on and on and on for the next 10 years.
What's been the last 10 years, correct, on average?
Average,
Well,
5 or 6. That's
Yeah.
dropping.
Is it
I would say that's right.
same population or is it different? Fact factor.
So you guys have collected over the last couple of years around between 5.5 to 7 million in system development fees a year. So kind of if you back into that, I think the growth in customer accounts and equivalent residential units is probably in the 6% range.
Okay.
So it's a little more conservative than that, but still on kind of the high end of where we were comfortable. And I'm not going to go through the rest of these in painstaking detail. Instead, what I'll do is I'll highlight the differences. So if you turn the page and you go to scenario 1B, this is at a 3% customer growth rate. So that results in about 4 to 5 million a year in system development fee revenues. And as you will see, when we get out to 2032, we've got a little bit of an issue here because one thing that we did was we put a constraint on the annual rate increases of 4%, because that's about where we've been the last several years. That seemed like a place that the town was comfortable. So we got this 4% constraint on here, and that means in 2032 to hit our metrics, we've got to dial back our CIP by $1.7 million. So we're funding the vast majority of the CIP. We're funding 99% of the CIP under the 3% growth scenario there. So again, that feels a little safer than scenario 1A, but the results are not quite as rosy. And then going down the line, again, I'll try to pick this up a little bit or move a little quicker. Scenario 1C, 2% growth. Again, 4% rate increase constraints. That results in not being able to fund about $25 million of our CIP. So now we're down to, we've cut, what is my percent there? We've trimmed 15% off of our CIP. We're still doing the same level of increase in rates, but our growth is not panning. And then finally, we've got our low growth forecast, which is 1% per year. And this is probably on the low end, and hopefully not how things shake out. But if everything dried up, per se, here's where we really start having problems, because now we can't even afford that $35 million borrowing at the beginning. We've got to cut that down. 17 million is kind of the max we can afford under this scenario. And you can see we really have to dial back our capital plan a lot. We've got to cut about 43% or 69 million out of that. So
I'm confused about this because wouldn't the slow growth mean you would delay the projects too, because you don't need them as soon?
yeah, and that's one of the limits here that we're up against is we don't have a CIP that is dynamic and adjusts itself. But a couple of these projects are not necessary, a couple of the big projects are not necessarily in our control. I mean, we've got the Cary projects, of course, that's kind of subject to when Cary just starts moving the ball on those. The Big Branch, that one's already, underway and already starting. So there's only, it's more of a thought exercise, I would say, than a real detailed engineering CIP management exercise. But just really trying to kind of paint the long-term picture here of how these things all interconnect.
I feel like this is a more objective understanding of how growth affects us and how, we end up saying things like we're stopping growth. As a policy decision, it affects us in ways that we don't even expect. We'll need to on some of these major projects.
And can throw the slide back up one more time.
Yeah.
Scenario 1D. And Nancy was mentioning earlier that our policies kind of help shape our projections. And as you can kind of see, our all-in debt coverage ratio with 1D, we're going underneath our 1.5 times around FY27. So we're with this scenario, we wouldn't be meeting our target, our metric. Just want to point that out.
Which line are you looking at?
Scenario 1D,
What-
around
what-
FY27, you see that we're dropped down to our all-in debt coverage to 1.46,
Okay.
and we're starting to get below that 1.5.
That row across from the yellow boxes.
Yes.
Correct.
And that's soon, right? That's pretty early.
Right, so we would have to start rethinking that, quite soon if we were going to go with this scenario. Yeah.
Road growth's not gonna be 1% next year.
Yeah,
It sounds.
we expect to be more than that. We
Yes,
just want to make
this
sure.
is a very conservative look, but we wanted to give y'all a range of scenarios from, the best possible to, worst case.
Is our model, I guess from planning or whoever, is it going to be like going down over time in the growth rate during this period, starting out way higher than 1%?
I mean, the model left flat.
The model here, I'm saying the real life model that we have.
So, yeah, so our real life growth model, which everything kind of. So a lot of our growth models, because we're 80% residential, so a lot of our growth models are based off residential. Obviously there is non-residential that affects the water growth model. Like we did. So they pull a lot of that in. So one, I hope we see with different projects going on at Gateway or wherever else that we have some non-residential growth that affects this. But in terms of our resident, I can speak more directly to our residential growth model because Marty and his team in planning worked really hard on that last year. And we have a model that was revised. Mike's team was in on that too, because we have physical limitations, carrying capacity that our community has based on water and wastewater. And so that was factored into it. In the scope of this, we are based on what's already been approved, what's building and what's in the pipeline. We're comfortable with, I think we'd be comfortable with around that 3 range for sure. The 4 the 4 is potentially sustainable as well. It's just, if you want to be a little more conservative on the 3 and go to 4%, we can do that. But what we see in that model, because I think our peak is actually in a couple of years on that model, if I'm not mistaken, based on what was in the pipeline and what's coming in terms of our annual growth. In a very general sense, not getting the percentages, but when you look at that model, we were between around 3,300 to 3,700 people annually. So obviously that percentage changes as you grow, but it was a pretty consistent number for that growth. And it's based off of, again, the projects, the CEOs coming in and how things time out. The peak was like 37 or 3,800 people a year. I can't remember exactly what year it is without looking. But we carried that model. I mean, you're only going to go so far, like we said. I mean, you build these models, and it's, you know, you're lucky if the 2 year is even close. You know, so, but we carried out in our population model. You know, once you kind of get beyond 10, you're really starting to kind of fall. I mean, but we definitely carried through the 10. That should have been formed as. I think it went to 2050, I think, on that model. And the growth, if that sticks, is there. But within the 10-year frame, I'm comfortable with these. And Marty and Mike might be able to speak to what they've seen as they've been measuring this.
The whole thing I would say is just, there's a lot of variability with the price of the projects. The construction costs continue to go. We're talking about 10 years down the road, these numbers, they're going to change quite a bit. We're already seeing that in the Western Lake Master Sewer Plan for that project. I think we've got, how much do we have in there for that? 30 million. We're going through that master planning process right now, but it just seems like everything is harder, more complex, and the costs are going to go up. We haven't got to the point to where we know that final number, but I would caution it's not going down. So if you're trying to figure out 2, 3, 4% or whatever, just keep in mind that those costs are likely to go up.
There's so many variables that you don't know which one's going to pace the other, right? Our growth may continue. It may continue at a good, healthy pace. But to Mike's point, if the market conditions create an inflationary adjustment that's higher than the growth rate, that changes this too. So all those change. But so you try and create that steady state, but we don't know really what that.
Jump back to this.
Question?
And
they-
I was gonna add to Sean's point, just keep in mind that this is a planning document. It's not anything that's set in stone, and it's something that we are able to model and review annually or even more frequently as needed. And so, as Mike mentioned, we've already been discussing that the cost, because we know cost and time is one affect modeling. And so just know that for the model, what we're presenting to you today says that it's going to be looked at periodically to make sure that we're staying on top of it. It's just a planning document at this point.
Thank you.
Just real quick on this slide here, it's in your packet. It summarizes the differences in the scenarios that I just talked. And I think that this is the good news for Apex, is under scenario 1A and 1B, which is a little more conservative, to deliver this CIP, the rate increases are really what I would say are really very manageable. I mean, when we see, and I know that's easy for me to say, I'm not the one sitting in the chair, but and that has been exacerbated over the last couple of years with what's gone on since COVID. So we work with all sorts of clients. If you told them that, a 4% increase, is looking pretty good for your 10-year forecast, they would trade with you on the spot. I can tell you that much. So I think that's the good news out of this exercise, is that, you guys do have a CIP, and like Mike said, there's definitely some uncertainty out there. But that's the way we tackle this financial planning, is we want to make sure we're doing it in a thoughtful and erring to the conservative side of things, so that we're prepared for that uncertainty when it comes. So are people feeling okay with where kind of these scenario 1A and 1B are a landing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure it'll be scenario 1A. Just like, I mean, just put it out there, like, but I'm not gonna let this go. I really feel like more of this should be funded by our SDFs. I think that our SDF fees are too low. And I know I can't set the SDF fee, but I recall there being some inputs, some assumptions that we had some discussion about. And also as our costs are rising and we're seeing all these, project costs increasing, you know, maybe it would be a good idea for us to do another, what do you call it, a rate study, what was it called? SDFE evaluation, whatever it is. We have to do it every 5 years. Maybe in this new environment, it would spit out a different number that would make that 2.2 still lower. Because I mean, 2.2% per year sounds great, but that's 2.2% on top of any cost we will have to drive for just operations and for, you know, people and other CIP stuff, you know, trucks and whatever. So, yeah, so, and, Randy, could you or someone dig up the last study that we did and send it out again? I remember talking about it, can't find it in my email. I know it's out there, because it was last year at some point.
Yeah.
Maybe with this context, I'll read it again and see if I can understand a little better. You guys lucky, I don't know. I remember him having the thoughts on it last time as well.
Yeah, yes, it did.
So a little like additional context, just to kind of wrap things up. In terms of what that looks like for fiscal 26. So the, you know, the town budget we just saw had the 4% increase in there. So that would be consistent with the scenario 1B. You know, again, it's a roughly $2.70 increase for the average Apex user. And then the question we always get, whether it's rate study, financial planning, or otherwise, is, well, what are our neighbors charging? And here's how that stacks up. You know, here's where you guys are today on the low end of this group. And there you are with the 4% increase. And you retain your position on this chart, which I think is the big takeaway. So that wraps up this presentation, but I'm happy to answer any questions or just if I'm left anything off for the town folks.
Did a great job. I think the previous slide really sums it all up, is the impact to our residents. And as you see under scenario 1A, it's actually the lowest impact that we have. So basically today we're just looking for some guidance on the scenario. We've already had a little input, but want to get our firm guidance on which scenario you guys are leaning towards.
When they.
Yeah, that'll be just a conservative.
I think 1A is already conservative. With the Soviet one. From the 1A.
Like majority is 1A. Sorry, so.
I just, you know, it's hard to know what we're gonna do next time, I mean, next council, and how the growth is gonna play out with the new developments that we're thinking about, possibly harder developments. That's what I'm thinking about is like, the less on our land is increasing what's left. Now we've heard development, so the speed at which we're doing things now is, fascinating.
We're on land the most. For the social Chatham County.
But we're not gonna do that, right?
We're not gonna do
So y'all, it eventually will be coming, no matter what, so just have to consider that. I mean, we've already expanded commercial, expect residential to happen at some point.
Thank you guys.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah, you bet. If you have any other questions or anything, please let me know. Happy to answer them. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you.
We are good. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Here we go. We're, thank you.
See if you can find this. Yeah.